The sun had barely kissed the edge of the horizon when Father Abel Mercer stepped out onto the chapel porch, a chipped tin mug of coffee in hand. The chill of dawn still lingered in the dusty air, wrapping Redemption Hill in an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch across the plains like an old wound. Most mornings passed like this, quiet, uneventful. But this one felt different. Something watched from the shadows. Then he saw it. A dog, thin as a shadow and just as silent. It stood at the edge of the chapel yard, its fur matted with burrs and patches of dried blood. Its eyes locked onto Abel's with a kind of mournful hunger, not just for food, but for something deeper, something forgotten. Abel took a step forward, and the creature didn't flinch. Poor soul, he muttered, setting his mug down. He disappeared inside and returned moments later with a crust of bread and a small strip of salted meat. He placed it gently on the dusty ground, then stepped back. The dog didn't move at first. Then, cautiously, it approached, sniffed the offering and devoured it in silence. It didn't wag its tail or bare its teeth. It simply ate, then sat back on its haunches and stared again. Abel narrowed his eyes. There was intelligence in that stare, not just animal instinct, but awareness. He lowered himself to one knee. "If this dog's got a soul," he whispered, "I'll find it." Behind him, the chapel bell swayed softly in the wind, though no one had touched it. Redemption Hill wasn't known for welcoming strays, neither animal nor man. The folk here were wary, shaped by dust, drought, and decades of unsolved sins. Superstition ran deep, especially when it came to creatures that arrived without cause. Later that morning in the general store, Old Man Pike spat on the floor and said, "A dog shows up like that, uncalled, unclaimed, ain't right." "Could be the grave dog." Abel raised an eyebrow. "The what?" Pike wiped his mouth. "Grave dog. Omen, some say. Brings things up from the dirt. Things that ought to stay buried." Abel didn't laugh. He never did. He just thanked the man for the sugar and left. That night, as the winds picked up and the moon rose pale and cold, Abel lit the chapel's oil lamp and found himself standing again at the door. The dog was still there, sitting as if waiting for instruction. The priest stared into the blackness beyond the chapel yard. Something stirred in him, curiosity maybe, or something older, more primal. He stepped outside slowly, the wooden floorboards groaning under his boots. The dog stood and turned, trotting toward the fog creeping in from the plains, and without knowing why, Abel followed. If this story's gripped your curiosity, make sure to subscribe now, so you don't miss what this stray will uncover when the night deepens in Redemption Hill. The dog moved like smoke between gravestones, silent and certain, leading Abel past the edge of the chapel yard. The wind picked up, whispering across the cracked earth, carrying with it a scent of something old, like rain on dry bones. Abel kept his distance, boots crunching over pebbles, his lantern casting long shifting shadows over the chapel wall. He paused. The dog stopped too, glancing back once before continuing toward a narrow path behind the chapel, where old fence posts leaned like drunken sentries. Abel hesitated only a moment longer before following. There was no barking, no growl, only the dog's quiet insistence and Abel's own strange resolve. By the time he returned inside, the oil in the lamp had burned low. He closed the chapel doors and sat down heavily in the pews, staring into the flickering flame. His mind spun with memories not yet called. The dog hadn't led him far, just to a section of ground he had rarely noticed. Still, something about it unnerved him. That night his sleep was broken by dreams he hadn't had in years. He saw faces from the war. Not the soldiers. No, it was the children he remembered most. Burned villages, cries in languages he couldn't understand. His role had been to offer comfort, but there had been times when he had done nothing at all. The weight of inaction pressed on his chest like smoke. The next morning, Abel found the dog waiting again. It sat by the chapel steps, unmoving. He fed it more meat, this time kneeling beside it. The dog ate slowly, as if savoring each bite, then licked its paws and laid its head on the ground. For a moment, they simply sat in silence. Later, during a visit to the trading post, Abel overheard more whispers. "You see that mutt?" said a young woman near the salt barrels. "That's no normal dog. That thing's been seen before the fire at Red Ash Mine and back when Mayor Travis's boy went missing, always right before someone finds bones." Abel turned away before they could see his reaction. When he returned to the chapel, he found a small bundle of feathers tied with twine hanging from the front door. A ward, if he remembered right. old tribal sign of warning. Not many from the old tribe remained near Redemption Hill, but someone remembered. Someone was watching. That evening, Abel walked the aisles of the chapel alone, whispering verses under his breath. The dog lay curled in the corner, but its eyes never closed. It watched him as if guarding something, or waiting for something to begin. The wind scratched at the chapel windows like claws. A thought rose in Abel's mind, unbidden and unwelcome. Maybe the dog hadn't come to be saved. Maybe it had come to lead him into judgment. It was just after dusk when the dog rose again. No sound, no bark, just movement, measured, deliberate, as it stood from its corner and walked slowly toward the chapel's rear door. Abel watched, heart pounding, a chill settling on his shoulders like a forgotten cloak. He lit the lantern with trembling fingers and followed. The sky outside had darkened to indigo, the stars hiding behind a thick veil of clouds. The air was still, unnaturally so. The dog didn't look back as it led him to the chapel's far wall, behind the vestry, where weeds grew thick and thorns tangled like barbed wire. Abel hadn't stepped into this patch in years. The dog stopped. Abel raised the lantern. The wall here was different. Older stones mismatched. A strange indentation near the base, as if something had once been wedged between them and ripped out. He moved closer, knelt and pressed his fingers into the cracks. The mortar crumbled like dry bread. A section of stone shifted under his touch. He pulled it free. Behind it, in a hollow space no larger than a child's cradle, he found a bundle wrapped in what once had been linen. It fell apart in his hands. Beneath it a tiny shoe, black leather cracked by time, and bones, small, fragile, a child. Abel jerked back, breath caught in his throat. The lantern swayed wildly in his grip. He knelt again, slower this time, and examined the hollow more carefully. There were more bones. Not many. Enough to suggest the child hadn't died in sleep. One arm bone bent wrong. The skull, soft and thin, bore a dent. He sat back against the wall, heart thudding so loud he could hear it in his ears. The dog sat a few feet away, silent, watching. Abel stayed there for a long time, lantern flickering low. Thoughts spiraled. Questions he didn't want answers to. Who would bury a child in the chapel wall? Why hide her here? And why had the dog known? Back inside the chapel, he locked the door behind him. Though he knew it wouldn't matter, he placed the tiny shoe on the altar, not out of blasphemy, but out of necessity. A mark, a reminder, a vow. He opened his old Bible and read the verse aloud, voice low and shaking. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought to light. The wind outside groaned. The dog curled up again in the corner, but it didn't sleep. Neither did Abel. Somewhere in the pit of his chest, he understood this was only the beginning. The next morning, Abel left the chapel early, the dog trailing him without command. The desert sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the cracked earth. Dust clung to his boots as he made his way to the edge of town, where the shacks thinned and the chaparral took over. He came upon a cabin leaning into itself, its wood faded to grey, its windows covered in thick cloth. Smoke curled from the chimney. He knocked once, then twice. A voice rasped from within. "Don't knock like a lawman. You'll get shot. It's Abel Mercer." A pause. Then, "Enter." Inside, the air smelled of sage, dried flowers, and something metallic. Rhea Blackthorne sat at a low table, blind eyes milky, her long silver hair braided tight against her back. She turned her head as he stepped in, as if she could see more than most with her sightless gaze. "You've been walking with death," she said without preamble. Abel didn't answer. Rhea reached for a small jar and unscrewed it slowly, spreading an oily balm across her hands. "I heard the dog came back." "You knew it." "I did. Long ago." Abel sat across from her. "I found a grave, a child, hidden behind the chapel wall." Rhea nodded, unsurprised. There was a time when that place was full of light, before the oaths were broken, before the land was taken. He frowned. "You're talking about the old tribe." She reached for a bundle wrapped in hide and unrolled it. Inside were bones, small, marked with carvings. They buried their dead with prayers. But when the chapel was raised, that ground was already sacred. They warned your kind. You didn't listen. Abel leaned forward. "You think what I found is connected?" Rhea smiled without warmth. "What you found is only one. You'll find more. The earth remembers." Back in town, the wind shifted. Sheriff Vaughn stood outside the saloon. his eyes tracking Abel as he returned. "You digging into old bones now, Father? Trying to understand what I've been given." The sheriff spit. "You're stirring up ghosts. We don't need ghosts around here. That child deserves to be known." The sheriff stepped closer, voice low. "So do the living. Redemption Hill doesn't survive by weeping over what's done. Let it lie." Abel didn't flinch. "God doesn't let anything lie." Vaughn's hand brushed the butt of his revolver just once before turning away. That night, the dog sat at the threshold of the chapel, eyes fixed on the horizon. Abel felt the weight of Rhea's words pressing against his chest. The land remembers, and perhaps so did the dead. The next morning, Abel pulled up the old floorboards beneath the pulpit. Not out of suspicion, but instinct, an unspoken guidance, something in the quiet insistence of the dog, who now lay by the altar watching every move. The first plank came loose with effort, dry nails squealing like birds. Beneath it, in the shallow crawl space, his lantern illuminated a box, small, rusted, the lid sealed with wax. He pried it open carefully. Inside, folded and yellowed, were letters, dozens, some torn, others pressed neatly, all addressed to Father Thomas Greaves, his predecessor. Abel took them upstairs and read them slowly, one by one. They spoke of prayers and confessions, of families broken by illness and hunger, but then they turned. A woman's handwriting appeared more frequently. Her tone shifted from reverence to fear. She wrote of whispers in the vestry, of locked doors and missing communion wine, of how her daughter no longer spoke. The final letter struck Abel like a hammer. "She cries at night, Father Greaves. She says the man in the black robe touches her in the dark. Please help her." There was no response. Abel set the letter down with shaking hands. The walls of the chapel pressed inward, air heavy and still. He looked to the altar, where the dog sat, unmoving. He returned to the hollow in the chapel wall and stared at the place he had found the bones. Had it been this child? He couldn't be sure. Later, as he walked through town, faces turned. The news had begun to spread. He had not spoken a word to anyone, but in Redemption Hill, silence was never protection. Secrets stirred on their own. Mrs. Carter, the storekeep's wife, crossed herself as he passed. The blacksmith looked away. Even the children stopped playing when they saw the dog at his side. That evening, Abel stepped into the confessional for the first time in years, not to hear confession, but to give one. He whispered, "I failed them, all of them, in war, in ministry. I turned away when I should have looked." The dog sat outside the booth, head raised. He continued, voice cracking, "If I was sent here to uncover truth, then let it be done, even if it destroys me." The wind howled through the chapel rafters. He closed the confessional door behind him and locked it. Then he retrieved the letters, folded them into a canvas satchel, and placed it under the altar. A marker, a promise. He would not let them be forgotten. And as he lit the evening candles, their flames flaring tall and sharp, he felt it. Something waiting just beyond the walls. Something waking. That Sunday morning, Abel stepped into the pulpit with a heart heavy as stone. The chapel was half full, more than usual. Word had spread like fire through dry brush, and now eyes watched him not with reverence, but wariness. He didn't preach, not truly. Instead, he read from Ecclesiastes about hidden things, about seasons for truth and reckoning. His voice was even, but his gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Sheriff Vaughn near the back pew, arms crossed, boots muddy from his morning patrol. After the service, Abel found the chapel door marked. A symbol had been branded into the wood, black and scorched, still warm to the touch. A crude cross, but upside down. A warning, maybe a promise. He said nothing, just ran his fingers across the char, then went back inside and knelt. The dog followed. In the hours that passed, Abel opened the old ledgers again, records from the earliest days of the chapel, marriages, births, deaths, but also names that appeared once and never again, whole families that vanished without notice. Their pages marked with brief notations, departed or moved east, but no destinations, no witnesses, and one entry from 1857 stood out. Burial denied, grounds sanctified, child unnamed. That night, the dog growled for the first time. It stood at the chapel door, teeth bared, low rumble in its throat. Abel took the lantern and stepped out. The wind was fierce, blowing grit across the yard, but still he saw them, figures near the fence watching. Townsfolk, 3, maybe 4, faces half hidden by hats and scarves, silent, One lifted a bottle and hurled it toward the chapel. It shattered on the stones. Kerosene. The smell was sharp, immediate. They didn't speak, just melted back into the dark. The dog barked once, sharp and violent. Abel stood his ground, heart pounding. The shadows swallowed the figures whole. Back inside he barred the doors. He prayed without words, only breath. That night, sleep didn't come. Memories returned instead. Not of Redemption Hill, but of war. He remembered the woman in white kneeling beside her burned cottage, begging him to help her son trapped beneath the wreckage. He had turned away, carrying orders from a captain whose name he no longer recalled. The boy had died screaming. In the candlelight, Abel whispered, "I left him. I left them all." The dog rested its head on his foot. He looked down. No more. By dawn, he had made up his mind. He would dig. No law, no threat, no branded symbol would stop him now. The first shovelful of dirt broke the silence just after sunset. Abel dug behind the chapel, in the hard-packed ground where the dog had first led him. The soil was dry, stubborn, clinging to the past like a secret long kept. The dog sat nearby, unmoving, eyes locked on every motion. A wind rose as he worked, dry and cold, and soon a dust storm began to roll across the plains, slow at first, then gaining speed, like a beast waking from slumber. He didn't stop. He had stripped off his coat, sweat clinging to his back, hands blistered. The hole deepened. The smell came first, faint, sour, wrong. Then his shovel hit something solid, wood, rotten, splintered. He dropped to his knees and pulled at it with both hands, revealing what had once been a box, no longer a coffin, just planks enclosing decay. And bones. Too many bones. Not one child. Several. Skulls, small and brittle. Rib cages tangled. One had a rosary still wrapped around its spine. Another a ribbon turned to threads. Abel stared, numb. Lightning flared in the distance. Behind him, the town had gathered. He hadn't heard them arrive, but now torches flickered along the edge of the yard. Faces half lit, eyes hard. They said nothing. They only watched. Among them stood Sheriff Vaughan, his badge glinting, his hand on his revolver. "Put the shovel down, Father." Abel didn't move. I said, "Put it down." Still kneeling, Abel turned. "You knew." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "I knew enough." "How many?" Abel's voice cracked. "How many children buried here?" Vaughan stepped forward, voice rising. "They were orphans. Bastards. No one was coming for them. They were sick, feral. Father Greaves gave them peace." Abel stood, fists clenched. "He murdered them." "He cleansed them," Vaughan growled. "He was keeping this town safe from plague, from sin, from scandal. You call that justice? I call it survival." The wind howled louder, swirling dust between them. The crowd remained still. Some lowered their torches. A few turned their faces away. Abel raised his voice, broken and raw. They weren't ghosts. They weren't curses. They were children. The sheriff drew his revolver. "Last warning." The dog stepped forward, growling deep and fierce. Abel didn't flinch. "You can shoot me," he said, "but this ground will not stay silent, not anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Then the dog howled. It was long, mournful, a cry that reached into bone, and one by one the torches began to lower, not from fear, but from shame. The next day the saloon stood quiet, not with the lull of rest, but the tension of something coiled and waiting. At noon, a makeshift gathering formed. Not official, not lawful, but necessary. Abel arrived with the dog at his side and a satchel of letters in his hand. The room was packed, townsfolk shoulder to shoulder, boots dirty from the chapel grounds. At the far end, Sheriff Vaughan leaned against the bar, arms folded, eyes cold. Rhea Blackthorne was already seated near the front, her hands wrapped around a cup of water she couldn't see. She nodded once when Abel passed. He placed the letters on a table. "I didn't come here to accuse," he began. "I came here to serve. But the ground has spoken and we must answer." Whispers stirred. "Mrs." Carter crossed her arms. The blacksmith stared at the floor. "These letters," Abel continued, "were written to Father Thomas Greaves. They speak of a child abused, of cries in the night, of silence that followed." He paused. "Let it settle." "Behind the chapel wall," he said, voice firm, "was one grave. Last night, we uncovered more." A woman near the back gasped. Rhea rose slowly, voice thin but steady. "We warned them long ago. The land was sacred. They built over the bones of our dead. And when their own died, when their shame festered, they buried that too. But Earth does not forget." A man stood. Joseph Pike, the store owner. "You want us to do what, Father? Tear down the chapel? Burn our own past?" "I want truth," Abel said. "No more hiding. No more silence." Sheriff Vaughn stepped forward. "And what about justice for Greaves long gone? For the town that only did what it had to do to survive?" "You mean murder," Abel replied. The dog growled softly. All eyes turned. The sheriff pointed. "That thing, this dog has brought nothing but dread to this place. It's not a sign of anything holy. It's an omen." "No," Abel said. "It's a witness." The dog stepped forward and lay at Abel's feet. The room stilled. After a moment, Ruth Marlowe, mother of two, stepped from the crowd. "My grandmother used to say the chapel wasn't safe, that the walls whispered. I thought she was senile now." Others followed. Quiet voices sharing doubts, memories, unease never spoken aloud. The sheriff's hand twitched near his belt, but he said nothing. Abel turned to the crowd. "The chapel should be cleansed, not erased. These children deserve names and peace. We all do." A silence followed, not of fear, but consideration. The crowd did not cheer. There was no applause, only slow, solemn nods. A shift. Truth had taken root. The chapel burned just past midnight. Abel woke to the crackle of flames and the distant barking of the dog. He ran barefoot into the yard, nightshirt flapping in the wind, and saw it. Orange light roaring through the stained glass windows, black smoke curling into the stars. The front door had been soaked in oil. The inverted cross was gone, replaced by fire. He rushed inside, shielding his mouth. The altar was already ablaze. He grabbed the satchel with the letters, his Bible, and the carved child's shoe from the pulpit. The heat clawed at his skin, smoke choking every breath. But he didn't stop, not until he stumbled out through the side door, coughing, eyes watering. The dog met him there. Together they watched the chapel fall. The flames consumed everything, the pews, the pulpit, the confessional, everything but the memory of the bones beneath. At sunrise, a group of townspeople arrived, eyes wide, faces drawn. Among them was Sheriff Vaughn. Abel stood, clothes singed, satchel tight against his chest. Vaughn dismounted slowly, but didn't speak. "You did this," Abel said, voice ragged. The sheriff shrugged. "No proof. You tried to erase it." Vaughn stepped forward, gun visible at his hip. "You've made this town weak, Mercer. Divided. We were better when the truth stayed buried." "You were safer," Abel answered. "Not better." The crowd behind the sheriff murmured. Someone said, "Enough." Another, "We deserve better." Abel stepped forward. The chapel was wood. Truth is stone. Vaughn's face darkened. "You want justice? Fine." He drew the revolver, but he wasn't fast enough. The dog lunged. Fur and teeth met flesh as Vaughn cried out, falling to the ground, his gun flung aside. The dog bit once, clean and deep, then backed away, silent again. Abel picked up the revolver and handed it to Ruth Marlowe. "No more silence," he said. By evening, Vaughn sat bound in the jailhouse, wounds cleaned, eyes hollow. He didn't deny the fire. He didn't explain it either. The town listened to Abel that night. He read the letters aloud in the square one by one. The people stood in silence, hats in hand, tears on faces that had not wept in years. They spoke the children's names when they could. For others, they made new ones, and when the reading was done, it rained. For the first time in 3 years, the skies opened. The dust turned to mud. The fire's scar hissed and cooled. Some said it was judgment, others a cleansing, but no one spoke against it. That night, the dog curled at Abel's feet, chest rising slow and even. Abel sat on the chapel steps, what was left of them, and looked to the sky. The ash washed clean. The past hadn't been erased, it had been faced. By the next Sabbath, Redemption Hill stood quiet under pale skies, the scent of rain still clinging to the air. Where the chapel once stood, townsfolk now gathered around a cleared space, ringed by stones, the ground smoothed and level. There was no pulpit, no stained glass, only silence, and Abel Mercer standing before them, worn Bible in hand, the dog lying at his side. He had named it Mercy. "Some truths," he said softly, "are buried not by accident but by choice, out of fear, out of shame. But silence is not peace, it is merely delay. He let the words settle. This ground will not be consecrated with wood or marble. It will be consecrated with memory. The townspeople stood in a wide circle. Some held flowers. Others carried handmade crosses, names carved into the wood, some real, some imagined, given in honor to the unnamed. One by one they stepped forward, placing their tributes on the earth. A child laid down a stone painted with the word, "Sorry." Rhea Blackthorn approached last, walking slowly with a carved cane. She placed a feather at the center of the ring, murmured words in a tongue nearly lost, and turned to Abel. "This time," she said. The ground was heard. Abel nodded. "And it will not be forgotten." The weeks that followed brought quiet change. The townspeople repaired the chapel steps and left them standing, not as an entrance but as a monument. The grave behind the wall was moved. Each child received a proper burial, marked and honored. And for the first time in a generation, Redemption Hill began to speak openly of its past. Mercy became a fixture, guardian, companion, and symbol. Some came from neighboring towns, drawn by stories of a priest who unearthed bones and wouldn't let them be buried again in silence. They brought candles, flowers, questions. Abel welcomed them all. He still dreamed of war, of children's cries in burning towns, but now, in the stillness of morning, he woke beside a graveyard that breathed lighter. The guilt remained, but so did the grace. And each Sunday, without fail, he read aloud the names. In a final gathering at the gravesite, Abel addressed the people once more. "We are not redeemed by forgetting," he said. "We are redeemed by remembering, and by choosing better even when it costs us." The people stood in silence. But this time it was not hollow. It was reverent. If you've journeyed this far with us through the dust, fire, and truth of Redemption Hill, make sure to subscribe now so you never miss another tale like this one. And don't stop here. Click the next video on your screen to uncover another haunting story of justice, memory, and the unseen hands that shape our fate.